Yat my relatives. It is Friday afternoon, about 1:37 actually. It's Friday, May 14th, and I'm just sitting down. I'm actually finishing up my second cup of coffee. I've been preparing for this live stream for a few hours, and I'm sitting down to share a few thoughts. I want to talk today about critical race theory. And so I've been getting some thoughts together and getting some stuff ready that I want to share. But as I always do before I start, let me begin just by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from Washington, D.C. And these are the traditional lands of the Piscataway. And I want to just state how humbled I am to be on these lands that have been stewarded by the Piscataway people. I want to thank them for their stewardship of these lands. And I just want to acknowledge their continued presence in these lands. Before I go on, I want to share this really quick onto my YouTube channel. So give me just a second to get this started here. This will take just a second. And then we'll be able to get going. All right. So yesterday afternoon, I began, or actually yesterday morning, actually, I began doing some research into critical race theory. If you're like me, we've all been seeing it kind of explode on social media. There's been yelling and screaming by a lot of white evangelicals and politicians, and we all know some about it, but I've been kind of familiar with the term and what is going on with it, but I've never really sat down and kind of went through the depths of what is really going on within critical race theory and why it's causing so much angst for everybody. I mean, we all know, like, the quote that President Trump gave. This was actually in a CNN article that I found this quote. But he said, students in our universities are inundated with critical race theory. This is a Marxist doctrine holding that America is a wicked and racist nation, that even young children are complicit in oppression, and that our entire society must be radically transformed. So I think most of the country heard that, and that was, kind of a dog whistle, and it got conservatives screaming on one end, it got progressives and Democrats screaming on the other end, and of course white evangelicals were kind of also in that mix. And so yesterday I Googled critical race theory, what is it? And one of the first sites that came up was actually from a group called the Heritage Foundation. And it was a video. I just watched it. It didn't say what it was about, which way it was leaning, but it was obviously a very conservative, a very even Trump-esque type view of critical race theory. And so it didn't help much. It just kind of reiterated the same points that Trump made. And then so I kept digging a little deeper, and I came across it was a Zoom call. Kind of a seminar that was put on by Villanova University. And it had two professors there who have studied and looked at critical race theory, and they were kind of answering some general questions about it. This happened, I think, in late 2020 or either early 21. And so I'm going to actually share that in the comments here. And if you want to see that, you can do. I've actually found some things pretty helpful in what they were saying. It's just what they're asking, what is critical race theory? And it was at Villanova University, and they just shared a few thoughts. I also listened to a podcast, or parts of a podcast, by Dr. Nathan Louis Cartagena. And he is a professor at Wheaton College, and he gave a fairly helpful definition. And he said that CRT is a legal movement aimed at understanding, resisting, and remediating how U.S. law and legal institutions have fostered and perpetrated racism and white supremacy. And I'm actually going to share a link to a podcast that he gave, and I'll put that in the comment section as well. And I think there's 4 parts to the whole podcast. I haven't listened to all of them, but I put them up, and they do provide some good and helpful information. I then went in and found a bunch of more academic type articles that were looking at the role of critical race theory, especially in higher education, right? Because of Trump's comments, that is where most of the angst is appearing, both politically as well as religiously. What are we teaching our children? What's happening with all this? And depending on where you're reading or who you're listening to, there are probably anywhere between 5 and 7 or 8 what people would call tenets of critical race theory. And this article is called "The Role of Critical Race Theory in Higher Education." It was written by Payne, Hiraldo, and I'm going to share this in the comments as well. And he identified some of the tenets. He talked about how critical race theorists use counter storytelling. He talked about they understand there's a permanence of racism and white supremacy. He talks about whiteness as property, that there is interest convergence, and a critique of liberalism. And those are 5 of the kind of main tenets that he lays out in that article. He gave some descriptions of them. I actually was taking some notes as I read through them. I'll just very briefly, counter storytelling. This is personal composite stories or narratives from people of color, right? If history is written by the victors, the counter narrative is the marginalized. And so critical race theory centers or highlights the counter narrative, the counter storytelling. Also, again, the permanence of racism. Racism is seen as an inherent part of American civilization, privileging white individuals over people of color in most areas of life, including in education. Whiteness as property. That was an interesting one. I actually talk more about that one later. I had to invest more time in understanding whiteness as property, because when we talk about race and property, we immediately think of enslavement and kind of the owning of people. Whiteness as property is actually an understanding of the benefits that come from identifying or being identified as white. Those are properties that can be had, they can be traded, they can be used, and they're treated as property. And so whiteness actually works hard to maintain control over those properties of whiteness, the things that they gain from identifying and being white. And then intersectionality. This is the notion that we tend to operate in binaries: black versus white, rich versus poor, good versus bad, all these types of things. And critical race theory works to acknowledge there's intersectionality. So the mistreatment of a person who is maybe a person of color, but maybe they're not dressed properly, and maybe they don't have the right clothes on, their mistreatment could either come from, or maybe they're a woman, or LGBTQIA and 2S+, so their mistreatment could not only come from race, it could also come from gender, or it could come from the way they're dressed and class, and that there's an intersectionality of all of this. And we can't just leave it in binaries, but we have to understand that there's levels to these things. And a lot of times in our country, we tend to treat things as binary because it makes things much simpler. And critical race theory works to acknowledge the intersectionality of all of these different things. There's also what's known as interest convergence. And this is an acknowledgement that the majority, the people in power, are not going to engage in this issue until it's proved to be a benefit to them. And so until there's proof of that, then they're not going to fully engage in this. And then the critique of liberalism. This stems from ideas of colorblindness, the neutrality of the law, and equal opportunities for all. So those are just some of the 5 more basic or major tenets of critical race theory that I was able to understand. And I actually found another very interesting article, and it's actually a chapter in a book. The book is the Handbook of Critical Race Theory in Education, and I found a copy of chapter 3 online. That chapter is authored by Gloria Ludson-Billings. And it's titled Critical Race Theory, What It Is Not. And I'm going to share that in the comments as well. because it actually provided a good kind of understanding of what critical race theory is not. And especially it looked at the component of counter-narrative and storytelling. And it really looked at how critical race theory is not just the airing of grievances or the stating of injustices, but it's providing a different narrative, and a narrative that actually helps to explain to people, not just pointing out what racism, white supremacy is, but to get them to understand more in depth of how that is a part of society. And so I found that article actually really interesting, just in describing this is not what critical race theory is. And I thought that was pretty useful. The article, the reading I found most helpful actually came from a book called Critical Race Theory in Higher Education, 20 Years of Theoretical and Research Innovations. It was written by Dorian L. McCorduck and Roderick, I forget his last name now. I don't have it written down here for some reason. Anyway, but I'm going to share a link to where you can find that online. You can't find the whole book, but you can look at kind of a preview of it. And I found one of their chapters in here was really helpful as far as understanding all of some of these different tenets on critical race theory. And right, so I'm just going to go through, they listed 7 of them. The permanence of racism, experiential knowledge or counter-narrative, interest convergence, intersectionality, whiteness as property, a critique of liberalism, and then an understanding that a commitment to social justice. And I want to just go through some of the things in that I came up with, because the more I read and the more deeply I got into this critical race theory, the more I began to understand why there's so much angst about it and why there's so much anger, especially from politicians and white evangelicals. So the permanence of racism, right? This acknowledgement in this theory, in this movement, that racism is not just the act of a few individuals who are behaving badly. It is a permanent part of American society. And acknowledging that it's institutional and it's normal and it's constantly there. That is a very key component of critical race theory. And it's not just we have to get rid of these few bad individuals, but we have to acknowledge this is a systemic, institutional, normal part of our society, and it needs to be addressed that way. The next one on experiential knowledge and counter-narrative, and this is actually where the previous article on what critical race theory is not was really helpful. Because understanding that the counter-narrative is not just telling stories of the injustices that come, but it's actually being very strategic about these stories. And it's about telling the stories from the perspective and the context of the people on the margins. A great quote I read somewhere in the midst of all this, I don't know exactly where it was now, but it said, until lions have historians, the stories of the hunt will always romanticize the hunter, right? Until lions have historians, stories of the hunt will always romanticize the hunter. And it's because they're the ones who are telling the story. So it's about their bravery and their acts and their strength and so on and so forth. And so the whole point of this experiential knowledge and counter-narrative is lifting up the voices of people from the margins. And this ties in actually incredibly well with the whole understanding of creating a common memory, right? We have these myths of American history that are absolutely just not true if they're only told from one perspective, and they don't acknowledge the injustices, the genocide, the enslavement, the dehumanization that was taking place. And so this creating of a common memory has to include, in fact, even some of the writings gave examples of how this counter narrative included things that like Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, where the stories of those oppressed were lifted up to the center. And so it's not just about letting these stories be written down and recorded, but actually centering these stories and allowing these stories to absolutely affect and change and impact the narrative. The acknowledgement of interest convergence. And this is actually where I think there's some very interesting things going on in here too. And it's an acknowledgement that the majority, because racism, white supremacy is a permanent part and an institutional part of society, the majority is not going to engage with this to deconstruct it until it's proven that this is actually going to be a benefit to them. And one of the examples they gave is in the 1960s, President Kennedy issued an executive order for affirmative action, and it was entirely based on race. Lyndon Johnson issued a more expanded version of that executive order, I think it was in 1967. And in his executive order, he not only included race, but he included sex or gender. And now affirmative action actually became much more central. And the reason for that is because by including sex, by including gender, white women were now able to be a part of affirmative action. And white women, especially in the 1960s, were most likely married to white men and almost always had white children. And so this meant that the white demographic was now able to participate and even take advantage of affirmative action. And again, this is just a normal, permanent, regular part of our society. There's an interest convergence. And acknowledging that can kind of take away the pride or the ego of white America, where they may say, well, we're doing this because we are just really good people. And it's actually, no, you're engaging in this because it's been proven to be a benefit to you. And that's the only reason you're in it. And that's actually why it gets skewed and even probably becomes even more permanent part of our society. The intersectionality, we already explained that, and I don't feel like this went even more into depth into that. The whiteness is property. This is where it's really understanding that it's not property as in much of like you own something, but it's properties of something that exist. And so it's the benefits of identifying as white must be protected. There's this exclusive club with limited resources. And so you have to protect that like you protect property. And that is a huge component of being white, right? This is even when I talk about, I don't like using the word white privilege because it talks about whiteness is somehow a benefit. It's somehow a blessing that needs to just be shared. But that's where this whiteness as property comes in. And it really creates a very exclusive club. And if you're somehow able to sneak into that club, you can enjoy some of those fruits. But it's about how whiteness protects itself and holds these things as exclusive for itself. The critique of liberalism, and this was probably the most helpful in here because as I was reading through and trying to understand critical race theory well, and as I would begin to understand that one of the reasons politicians and white evangelicals are so opposed to critical race theory is because it gives you the tools to deconstruct the myth of American exceptionalism and counter the lie of white supremacy, right? If you understand that racism and white supremacy are not acts of a few bad individuals, but they're a permanent, normal part of this society, that's a critique on the entire society. It's hard to claim you're exceptional when you are acknowledging that racism and white supremacy are a permanent, normal part of your society. Because critical race theory centers the voices and the stories and the counter narratives from people on the margins, this is going to absolutely disrupt the myth, right? If the myth exists solely because only white people are writing the history, allowing the voices of other peoples from the margins to tell their stories, to let their narratives be told, that's going to disrupt that myth. And so the challenge, though, is because of the way Trump addressed it and because of the way it's been playing out in the media, we are seeing critical race theory as a partisan issue. We're seeing it as right versus left. We're seeing it as Republicans seeing this as bad, and Democrats are on the favor, on the side of critical race theory. And that's some of the narrative that's being brought out there because of how polarizing Trump is and how critical he was of critical race theory. This actually made this a partisan issue, or is attempting to make it a partisan issue. But American exceptionalism, and I would even argue the lie of white supremacy, are bipartisan issues. They're bipartisan values, right? One of the most dehumanizing Supreme Court opinions written in my lifetime was written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, referencing the doctrine of discovery. Why? Because land titles are based on the fact that natives are classified as savages. So this makes white supremacy a bipartisan value. And so I'm afraid of us making critical race theory a partisan issue, which will allow the Democrats to not be critiqued by this theory, because they will say we are on the side of deconstructing this, and Republicans are the ones holding it up, blah, blah, blah. So I actually want to read this. It was a fairly short section in this reading. Critical race scholars are critical of and challenge the concepts of objectivity, meritocracy, colorblindness, race neutrality, equal opportunity, and incremental change. It asserts that these concepts act as camouflage for the self-interest, power, and privilege of dominant groups in the United States and society, and suggests that at face value, these concepts appear to be desirable goals. However, they argue, given the history of racism in the United States, this is not possible. Colorblindness, the belief that race does not matter, fails to consider the permanence of racism. Manning, one of the authors, suggests that it is the misguided belief in the equality of people because they are human. Decor and Dixon, two other references, suggested that embracing colorblindness ignores that inequality, inopportunity, and oppression are historical artifacts that will not easily be remedied by ignoring race in the contemporary society. Critical race theory can challenge the erroneous belief that colorblindness is synonymous with the absence of racism. Individuals committed to social justice that consistently challenge the way that racial advancements are promoted through white self-interest and a colorblind ideology. Incremental change is the concept where change for people of color and other marginalized groups occur in an acceptable manner to those currently empowered. Those individuals already in positions of power are not adversely affected by the inequality that results from racism and other forms of oppression. An example of this is the South's slow response to the Brown versus Board of Education decision. Many people in the South were not only opposed to integration, but they argued that if it were to happen, it had to occur in a slow, methodical manner, acceptable to white people. Despite being ordered to integrate with all deliberate speed, most Southern school systems did not integrate until the beginning of the 1970s, 14 years after the Brown decision. See, now, again, if we make critical race theory a partisan issue, Democrats will say, well, it's the South that was doing this, it's acting in their self-interest, and they won't acknowledge their own complicity in the permanence of racism and white supremacy. They want to acknowledge their own complicity in the implicit manifestations of racism, sexism, of racism and white supremacy within our country. And they'll make it into a partisan issue where it's the Republicans' fault and the Democrats are on the side of these things that are good. And that is absolutely not true. We see this now, even with the way President Biden was responding, right, to the lynching of George Floyd. Absolutely opposed to things like defunding the police, suggesting we just need more training to shoot people in the kneecaps instead of in the chest. Resistant to any kind of systemic change. right? Telling us, literally, he said this on his campaign, that fixing these problems is going to be slow in coming. It's a long journey to equality. And I've said this throughout my campaign and even since then. The only reason it's a long journey is not because people from the margins don't understand our own agency of our own humanity. It's not because we're not ready to fully participate at the tables around this country. It's because white people don't want to give up the spaces. And the Democrats are just as guilty of that as the Republicans are. And so this issue on the critique of liberalism is really, really important, because Democrats are not going to look closely at that, and they are not going to acknowledge their own complicity in that. They are going to fight to make this a partisan issue rather than bipartisan value. And then the last was a commitment to social justice. That this movement is about bringing about change. It's about confronting these systems, deconstructing them, and trying to bring about change. As I read this, and as I was looking at all of this material, both yesterday and today, I've spent hours trying to really get down into the nitty-gritty of some of this. And as I begin to understand that, yeah, this is really, it gives you the tools to deconstruct the myth of American exceptionalism and to counter the lie of white supremacy. And that's why it's such a threat. But I also realized that most of the dialogue around critical race theory is black versus white. And I think it started with, again, it started out of the civil rights movement, went into the legal arena, and that was largely about black versus white. And that's even one of the myths that we have in America, is that racism, the definition, even the binary of racism in the United States is black versus white, and that's not true. So I was trying to understand, where does the acknowledgement of the injustices against Native peoples come in? Rather than as somewhere intersectional between these two binaries, where does it come in even as a more primary source? And I actually found that there's such a thing as tribal critical race theory. Tribal crit is the way it's referenced. And there was an article, and I'm going to share this right now. Let me get it on here. It was an article published titled "Unmasking, Exposing, and Confronting Critical Race Theory, Tribal Critical Race Theory, and Multicultural Education" by Jeanette Haynes-Ryder at the New Mexico State University. And let me share the link for this article. I actually found it helpful. I'm not going to go too in-depth into tribal critical race theory right now, but I found in this article they actually had a definition of critical race theory that I thought was very helpful. In the mid-1970s, critical race theory, CRT, developed in the United States out of critical legal studies to examine the relationship between race, racism, and power. A basic assumption is that racism is not merely individual acts of discrimination, but rather historical, systemic, and ideological manifestations of power to serve, maintain, and protect white privilege. CRT includes an activist dimension along with this examination to facilitate transformation. The goal of CRT is to construct an alternative reality by naming one's reality through storytelling and counter-storytelling. Thus, the advantage of CRT is the voice that it provides people of color. I felt like that really brought things down to the heart of what I had already concluded as I was reading all these other articles. And I think that is absolutely why CRT is causing so much angst within our political circles, within our religious circles. White evangelicals and Republican politicians are the ones screaming the hardest right now. But progressive religious people, progressive Christians, and Democratic politicians are looking for ways to make this a partisan discussion rather than a critique on the nation as a whole. And the danger that both sides will see to this narrative, to this movement, is that it is centering, lifting up, allowing the people from the margins, the people of color, BIPOC voices, to participate in a central way in the storytelling and constructing the counter narrative. This is, I'm not even quite sure where to go with this, right? Because the challenge is we're debating a theory, and we're not actually dealing with the change. And this is the challenge when we allow things to exist in an academic space, is we scream about these things, and we're able to scream about them at arm's length because we leave it in an academic space, instead of actually just providing the counter narrative, instead of actually just lifting up these other voices. I would rather see people scream, not because of what's being proposed to be taught, but because of the stories that are being told. And I think that's the danger, one of the dangers of engaging too intentionally in this whole discussion on critical race theory. It's because it can quickly become something where we're debating a theory and we're debating an academic idea rather than actually doing the work of centering the voices from the margins and lifting up the stories of people of color. And so that's where I want, if I'm going to get yelled at, I want to get yelled at not because I subscribe to this theory or I'm a part of that movement. I want to get yelled at because we're actually telling this story. We're actually lifting up these narratives. We're actually critiquing Abraham Lincoln. We're actually doing all these things. We're calling out Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I'd rather get screamed at for that than for just subscribing to a critical race theory. And so we have to be careful not to get sucked too deeply into this debate. Because again, I think even the progressive side would rather have the debate over the theory than actually have the deconstruction of the myth of American exceptionalism and the lie of white supremacy. And so rather than debating with them about these academic ideas, let's actually do the work of lifting up the stories. Let's tell the history. Let's center these voices. Let's get in trouble for things actually worth getting in trouble for. Creating a common memory. Removing racism, sexism, and white supremacy from our foundations. Deconstructing the myth of American exceptionalism. Countering the lie of white supremacy. Let's give ourselves to these sorts of things. I hope this is helpful, my relatives. I've spent the better part of the past 2 days trying to understand all of this, trying to go as deep as I can into all these things. I was hoping to do a live stream this afternoon about chapter 1 of my book. But because I've spent so much time on this critical race theory stuff, I won't have time to do that now. I'm thinking I'll either do it tomorrow or early next week. I still don't want to miss an entire week. So I'm going to try and get it done over the weekend. And I'll promote it on my social media when I decide to do that. But thank you for joining me for this second cup of coffee. I've been nursing this coffee for a few hours, so it's actually kind of lukewarm right now, which I don't like. But yeah, I'm very grateful we had a chance to talk about these things. Would love to have your ideas and to hear your thoughts about this. And I may even try to bring someone on in the future to actually have a more dialogue about critical race theory on one of my second cups of coffee. So I may try to do that in the next week or two. But until then, I hope you have a great rest of the day. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. And let's walk in beauty. and let's learn how to walk in beauty with one another. I can't have my relatives. How going that?